So I'm standing next to the Route 417 where, unfortunately, I executed an emergency landing after my crankshaft failed and the propeller completely departed my aircraft, which is a pretty unheard of situation. We just drove about 11 hours from Maine to take the wings off and trailer this plane back home, but as you can see, we got the blue tarp special here. Last summer, I fulfilled my dream of buying this little homemade airplane and flying it halfway across the country. I documented and shared this story online, and to my surprise, it resonated with thousands of people. I only wanted this to be the start of the amazing adventures that I would take with this plane. So after this, I spent hundreds of hours working on, tinkering with, and upgrading the plane in preparation for the journeys ahead. Unfortunately, on my first major flight away from home, I experienced an in-flight crankshaft failure, which resulted in the propeller completely departing the airplane in flight. Luckily, this resulted in a successful emergency landing with no injuries to myself or others, and no damage to any property on the ground. I'm heartbroken to say that this is going to be the end of my journey with this little plane, but it's certainly a story worth sharing. So on November 11th, 2023, while flying from Portage County, Ohio to Olean, New York, about 2 hours into a flight, I started experiencing minor vibrations. This got my attention as I began to troubleshoot by adjusting the fuel-air mixture, testing each of the ignition systems, and adjusting the power. Unfortunately, none of these made any impact on the vibrations as they continued to increase. Within 2 minutes, the entire instrument panel was shaking so badly that it was completely unreadable. I changed to the emergency radio frequency 121.5, and shortly thereafter, the entire propeller, spinner, and flange assembly completely departed the aircraft and whizzed over my head in a black blur. Without the load of the propeller, the engine quickly spooled up. I declared an emergency with ATC, gave my position.
Experimental November 5560 declaring an emergency. We are 17 miles southwest of Oscar Lima X-ray. Our prop seemingly fell off our plane.
At this point, I had been about 2 minutes from the onset of the vibrations, and I was essentially in a glider, and I was cruising along around 3,500 feet, which gave me about 3 minutes before I would be touching down on the ground. I touched down and came to a stop pretty much right next to that sign right there. Luckily, the route that I had planned was to fly along New York Route 417 all the way to my destination where I would spend the night. I just happened to be over a long straight stretch of this road, which essentially acted as a long runway. There were a couple cars on each side of the road. The ones facing towards me pulled off to the side when I came into view, which was surprisingly low, as I don't think they noticed me until I was about 100 feet above the ground. And the ones facing away from me were driving away, luckily faster than my touchdown speed. Coming in silently, there's a good chance that they never even knew I was there. So I came to a complete stop and I hopped out of the airplane. Interestingly, the very first thing that happened when I hopped out of the plane was that I received a text message from my dad. He had been periodically following along my trip using Find My iPhone and saw that my location was updating, but it wasn't moving. At this point, I was just in complete shock. 5 minutes earlier, I was cruising along without any problems, and now I was standing on the side of the road next to an airplane without a propeller. Someone stopped and got out of their car and asked if I was okay, and within a few minutes another person came over with a chain and offered to help me move the plane off the road. We were able to move it around 100 feet to a gravel parking lot nearby, which is definitely a safer spot than in the middle of the highway. After this, I gave a call to air traffic control and explained to them that I was all right, and they were pretty happy to hear that the landing was successful. I'm sure one of the hardest parts of their job is hearing emergencies unfold, as pretty much every controller that I've talked to has had a story of hearing someone's last words on frequency. About 10 minutes later, the first police officer arrived on scene and began collecting information on the incident. Within another 10 minutes, there were probably 8 police cars just lining the road.
You can't park there!
One of the things that shocked me was just how hectic the next 3 hours were. This started off with giving statements and then sharing all the documentation that I had for myself and the aircraft. The police notified the NTSB and the FAA, and shortly thereafter, I received phone calls from both of them. Both were primarily just glad to hear that the situation had a successful outcome and that everybody was okay. Interestingly, my insurance company actually called me before the FAA or the NTSB. It was amazing to me how quickly the word spread to all of these agencies. The next 30 minutes was spent with the police officers trying to figure out what we were going to do with this airplane. The original plan was to get a tow truck and bring the plane to the nearest airport, but of course the plane wouldn't fit down a single lane. Luckily, some of the officers were able to get in touch with the owner of the gravel lot, who said I could keep the plane there as long as needed. After this, I got a ride from one of the officers to a nearby hotel, where I could finally sit down and talk to my close friends and family and let them know that I was okay. And the next day I hopped on a commercial flight and made my way back home. Of course, the next problem that I had was recovering the airplane and bringing it back to my home airport. My mom and I ended up renting a 17-foot landscaping trailer, loading the truck up with a bunch of tools and taking the 10.5-hour road trip from Maine all the way to Olean, New York. The next day, we removed the wings from the aircraft and began loading the plane up onto the trailer. We've loaded up the Sonics into the trailer. Ended up being about a 4.5-hour job. We're a little worried at first that this trailer wouldn't be big enough. Well, we definitely couldn't have gotten by with any smaller of a trailer. A little bit of a sad sight seeing this here, but it certainly could have gone so much worse. This was followed by a slightly more stressful 10.5-hour road trip where we brought everything home. Altogether, it took us 4 days for this recovery mission. Since then, the plane's been stored back here in the hangar with the wings removed. Understandably, my friends, family, and close mentors in aviation are all reluctant to see me get back in this airplane. It honestly breaks my heart to have to let this plane go, especially with the big plans that I had for it and the time and effort that I invested into making it something great. Ultimately, I think it's the right decision, and it will hopefully make way for another airplane someday, something probably with a certified engine. So my original plan for this trip was to fly from Maine to Indiana with a friend of mine to visit some college classmates before continuing down to Florida. And we are about to depart on a 3,000 plus mile journey. Today, we're going to be trying to make it to Indiana in this plane, which should be about 9 hours of flying. We're going to be heading to Portland International Airport. I'm going to pick up my friend and my coworker there. It's going to be a little bit tight. Won't be able to take a lot of bags, but should be a fantastic time. And I just got all the certifications done for this aircraft to be IFR capable, which is pretty cool. So hopefully we'll be staying VFR for the entirety of this journey, but it's good to know if something happens, we have that option available to us. Unfortunately, we only ever made it to Ohio, where we got stuck for 3 days due to a rough running engine. We would eventually find out through several rounds of troubleshooting and consulting with multiple aircraft mechanics that we had a vapor lock problem. Essentially, the fuel line was routed too close to the hot exhaust pipes, causing vapor bubbles to form in the fuel line. This would cause brief interruptions in fuel flow to the engine, resulting in momentary stutters. And hearing the engine stutter in a small plane like this is not a very good feeling. Luckily, we were able to resolve this issue, but after 3 days stuck in small town Ohio, we were pretty defeated. My buddy ended up heading north to visit some family nearby in Toronto, and I continued on my way solo back to Maine. I have to say it felt pretty good to be flying along for 2 hours with no problems after having spent 3 days trying to troubleshoot what was wrong. Unfortunately, that feeling would be short-lived, as 2 hours into this flight, I would experience the, to my knowledge, unrelated crankshaft failure and loss of the propeller. One thing this situation has taught me is the importance of the reality check, especially when it comes to differentiating between what's legal and what's actually safe. I think the story behind this plane is an interesting one, as to my knowledge, it's literally the cheapest fully IFR certified airplane in the entire country. So I want to share with you how I got this idea, how I made it happen, how much it cost me, and maybe why it wasn't such a good idea. Oh, it got way too cold. So college is where I got this idea that I would buy this ultimate budget airplane and buy these super affordable old avionics on eBay and make it fully capable of flying at night and IFR. And with this, I'd be able to pursue my passion of making videos as I got to explore the entire country. In a way, I did everything that I possibly could to make this dream a reality and got very close to making it happen. However, in this pursuit, I later found out that I diminished many real-world risks. I'm sure most of you are coming from the video where I purchased this airplane, so what did I do after I bought it? So I started by planning out the upgrades that I wanted and started tackling them one by one. The first being the installation of an air oil separator. This would recapture oil coming from the engine's breather tube, and rather than blowing this all over the belly, it would recycle this back into the engine. This would reduce oil consumption and eliminate having to constantly clean oil off the belly of the plane. The bottom of the air oil separator will drain and go back in up here to be the return line for oil back into the engine. After this, the next upgrade was the installation of hydraulic brakes. The old cable brakes never worked very well, so I bought a hydraulic brake kit and got to work plumbing and installing them on the aircraft. This is going to be the plate that the brake rubs up against. By pushing on this, that will compress the brakes, and then once the brakes are set, I can close this valve, which will essentially act as a parking brake. The addition of the hydraulic brakes greatly increased the stopping power of the airplane, and on top of this, it made the plane safer and more enjoyable to fly. After this, the next major upgrades on my horizon were aircraft lighting and IFR avionics. The plane originally had no lights installed, which restricted it to flying from sunrise to sunset. Working as a flight instructor at the time, I was using this plane to fly all over Maine to meet up with students where I would instruct in other certified aircraft. Having to return home before sunset imposed some pretty big limitations on when I could work, often resulting in me having to drive. So I went ahead and got some navigation, strobe, and landing lights and began the long process of fabricating, wiring, and installing them. This alone took probably 80 hours of work. However, the satisfaction of finally seeing all these lights come to life was truly an incredible feeling. Above all else, what I spent the most time working on was definitely the avionics. From the start, I had this idea that I would purchase all of the most affordable used avionics that I could find in order to fully equip this plane for IFR. So instrument flight rules, or IFR, are the set of rules that allow you to fly through clouds. Of course, when flying through clouds, you can't see anything outside. Because of this, you must have certain equipment installed in the airplane in order to navigate and keep your aircraft upright when you can't see which way is up and which way is down. The one problem is that new avionics are expensive, really expensive. So, with cost being my biggest limiting factor, I turned to buying used, older avionics. They certainly weren't as nice, but are simple, certified, and have a track record of reliability. The first piece of equipment that I bought was this Terra TXN 960 navigation and communication radio. From this unit, there are two antenna cables which run through the tail of the aircraft, and one runs up to this VOR antenna, and the other is this communications antenna. This would allow me to use ground-based radio stations to navigate from point A to point B, as well as talk to air traffic control. This unit cost me $250, and comparatively, here's what a modern navigation and communication radio would run you. The next unit I needed was a GPS, so I asked a local aircraft maintenance shop if they had any older units they'd be willing to sell. Amazingly, the owner of the shop gifted me this Garmin 155XL, which was exactly what I needed. This is honestly one of the nicest gifts that I've ever received, so thank you. In order to display the GPS on my primary flight display, it required this module which has several knobs for setting courses, altitudes, and headings. The unit I needed was incredibly hard to find, but after months of waiting, this one finally popped up on eBay. The GPS also requires several external lights and switches for giving alerts and selecting modes. You can buy a unit for this, however, the installation manual, along with this helpful forum post, explain how you can wire this up for yourself, which saves a few $100. Redundancy is incredibly important in aviation, and I needed a backup for my primary flight display. This Dynon D3 was the perfect solution. Typically these units run for $900, but I was able to pick this one up secondhand for $499. And lastly, I picked up this two-person intercom, which allows the pilot and passenger to talk to each other through their headsets. Overall, with the purchase price of the aircraft and the cost of brakes, lights, and avionics, I was all in for $18,500. Flying under instrument flight rules can be incredibly rewarding in its technical complexity. On top of this, it increases the total number of flyable days available to you, as visibility and cloud cover no longer become as much of a limiting factor. However, as many people pointed out, the light control inputs of the Sonex airframe would make for a challenging IFR platform. And on top of this, the Volkswagen engine used in this plane is not known for its reliability. With there already being risks associated with flying in instrument conditions, adding on a non-certified car engine, as I would later find out, would confound the risks even further. It goes back to the point that, although I was perfectly within my legal right to do this, I fell into the trap of assuming that legal meant safe enough. A quick aside, the engine in this airplane is actually an aircraft conversion of the same engine used in the Volkswagen Beetles and buses. They're fantastic and incredibly affordable little engines which can safely be used in aircraft. However, they don't have the same safety rating that certified aircraft engines have, like the ones you would typically find in an airplane being flown under IFR. Because of this, it's generally accepted that they're great for flying under day VFR conditions where
the chance of a successful emergency landing, if an engine failure was to occur, is high. However, flying at night or under IFR would impose a risk that most pilots would deem as too high. And this is what has been so eye-opening for me, as I was lucky to have had my engine failure happen under day VFR conditions. But if this situation were to have happened at night or in instrument conditions, the outcome likely would have been different.